Welcome to the Big Smoke Variety Show. I'm your host, Kevin Bennett, and you've tuned in to our summer silly season. Back in 1861, the phrase silly season was coined to describe that sleepy stretch of summer when there wasn't much real news to report, and newspapers began filling their pages with wonderfully oddball stories instead. Well, here at The Big Smoke, we thought we'd celebrate the silly season with a double bill of stories you haven't heard. Perfect for listening to as you sit on the deck watching the stars or while roasting marshmallows around a crackling campfire. So settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy not one but two classic tales, written and performed by the wonderful Scott Brooksbank.
Dionyssia, or Why the Sea Moans. This is a story from Brazil, which was known primarily as a tale passed orally from storyteller to storyteller. It was first recorded in print in the English language in 1917 by an American researcher called Elsie Spicer Eales. She compiled a book called Fairy Tales from Brazil. Here we go. Did you know there was a time when the sea used to be silent? I know it sounds a bit like a fib, but it's true. So they say. Where are you right now? If you've got headphones on, take one out for a moment. What can you hear? Are you travelling somewhere? On a train or a bus? Listen to the engine. Or if you're at home, maybe open the window. What's the loudest sound you're aware of outside? How many different sounds can you identify? Now, imagine for a moment that all of those sounds stop. Imagine that you could still see that thing over there which was making a noise, or feel the vibrations of the bus or train or car that you're travelling in, but you can't hear a thing. And not because you're unable to, because making a sound is not something they do yet. That's what the sea was like once. There was once a princess called Dionyssia. She lived in a beautiful palace. It was full of people, night and day, and yet she was incredibly lonely. If she'd been able to look at us today, walking down the street, plugged in, many of us living solo lives in a city of millions, or curating our own entertainment while our loved ones in parallel listen to or watch something completely different in another room under the same roof, she would have nodded quietly and said softly, "I know." She used to go down to the beach and watch the sea. And even though the waves made no sound, she loved the shape they made, the way they caught the light, the feel of the water on her legs and feet. She imagined that the waves were calling to her. Dionyssia, Dionyssia. One day, a sea monster appeared on the shore. I know, just go with it. At first, Dionyssia was very scared. It looked a lot like a giant sea serpent, and its drooling mouth was enormous and held what seemed to be hundreds of sharp teeth, not to mention the spines on its back and pointed, dagger-like tail. But then she noticed that the monster had kindness in its eyes. "Hello," it said. And so they started talking. The monster, whose name was Labismena, was also lonely. Could they be friends? They became best friends, and they played regularly for years. One day, Dionyssia, now a grown woman, arrived at the shore in tears. Her father had told her that an old widower king had asked for her hand in marriage, and her father wanted her to accept. An old man! Labismena gave her this advice. She should say that she would marry him on one condition, that he gave her a dress, but not just any dress. Have a look around you. Can you see someone nearby who's wearing something extraordinary, something you've never seen before? Or if you're at home, perhaps you could imagine that in your wardrobe or drawer you have an item of clothing so outrageous, so impossible, that you've never dared to wear it, even in the privacy of your own room. Labismena's idea was this. The king should have to give her a dress that was the colour of the sky, the stars, and the whole unknowable universe. Otherwise, no marriage. An impossible challenge. Unfortunately, the king accepted the challenge and sent the dress. The marriage was on. Once again, Dionyssia ran to the shore, feeling helpless. But just as the tide comes in twice a day, Labismena was equally reliable and appeared to her friend, as she always did, ready to help. She gave Dionyssia a magical boat which would take her to a faraway kingdom where there happened to be a young, gorgeous prince who was also very nice and did things like call his mum and stuff. Oh, and she should take that amazing dress with her, the one that was the colour of the sky, the stars, and the whole unknowable universe. Might come in handy. Dionyssia stared at her best friend with tears in her eyes. "How can I ever repay you?" she said. Labismena's eyes flamed. "Break my curse. I was once a beautiful princess like you, cursed to roam the seas as a monster. The curse can only be broken by the happiest woman in the world at the moment of her greatest happiness. Call my name 3 times at that moment." Dionysia's heart leapt. "Yes, of course," she said. "I will." Over the sea went Dionyssia. She found herself in the kingdom where the prince lived, and basically things proceeded in a Cinderella-like fashion from then on. She got herself a job in the palace henhouse. Nobody wanted to talk to her, mainly because she smelt of chicken poop, but then she discovered that the chickens there were no ordinary chickens. They could talk. They told her that the prince was hosting a great ball. As luck would have it, one of the more standoffish chickens turned out to be a kind of fairy godmother who not only managed to wangle a deal with the henhouse manager to clear her work schedule on the night of the ball, but magicked up a magnificent gold carriage and horses in which she could travel in style. She also cleaned her up and gave her a complete makeover. And then, of course, there was the impossible dress. When she put it on, most of the chickens simply fainted. And even though she did travel to the ball in the carriage, she needn't have bothered. Her dress alone made the crowds part in wonder. And when she arrived at the palace, nobody even asked for her invitation. They just waved her in. Those who were still able to move anyway. And at the ball, she was the focus of everyone's attention. The prince, of course, fell utterly in love with her and refused to dance with anyone else. But as is the way with these stories, at midnight she had to go. Otherwise the gold carriage would turn back into something or other. So suddenly she ran out, mid-waltz. The prince, though, was a determined young man, and he gave literally every employee in the palace the task of finding her. He vowed never to rest until he had tracked her down. In fact, it all happened quite quickly. By lunchtime, he'd found her at the henhouse. He proposed, and they got married. And at the ceremony, as Dionyssia looked into the gorgeous eyes of her gorgeous new husband, her heart soared. Not that a prince is the only thing that can bring happiness to a young person, but he really was a smashing fella, and almost in spite of his lineage. She had never been, and never again would be, so happy. So happy that she forgot her promise to Labismena. And by the time she did remember, married life had soured a little, and, well, her moment of greatest happiness had passed. And as for Labismena, she waited and waited. Just as the tide comes in twice a day, sure enough, twice a day, Labismena appeared on the shore, each time wondering if this would be the moment. But she waited in vain. And that's why, if you go to the seashore now, you can hear her voice moaning, Dionyssia, Dionyssia, Dionyssia. Try saying it yourself. Maybe into your hands, or into a cup or glass you have nearby. Or maybe you can just keep your headphones on and see which bit of the word resonates most as you say it. Go on. Nobody's watching. And if we all had our voices, Dionyssia might finally hear. You never know. The Frogs. This is a story originally written as a play by Aristophanes, an Athenian playwright sometimes referred to as the father of comedy. You might have heard of his plays Lysistrata, or The Clouds, or The Birds, or indeed The Wasps. Well, this is The Frogs. A long time ago, if you like dates, we're talking just over 400 BCE, Athens was facing uncertainty and decline, and the god Dionysus was becoming increasingly troubled. As well as being the god of wine, winemaking, grape cultivation, fertility, ritual madness and religious ecstasy, in itself a rather overachieving list, he was also the god of theatre. And in his role as what he liked to call chief patron of theatre, he had always taken huge pride in the power of drama to inspire, challenge and guide people. But now, something was wrong. The great tragedian and playwright Euripides had died, and with him seemed to have gone the sharp, questioning voice that had once shaped Athenian thought. Dionysus found himself missing not just Euripides, but the whole golden age of theatre. The plays being performed these days no longer seemed as bold or meaningful. After much complaining, he came to a decision. No use harping on about it, time to act. He would travel to the underworld and bring Euripides back. Yes, I know, but he was a god, so he could do this. But it was still a dangerous journey, so Dionysus decided to disguise himself as the great hero Heracles, who had travelled to the underworld before. He threw a lion's skin over his shoulders and found himself a club, convinced this would make him look brave and impressive. Sadly, though, he lacked Heracles' strength and confidence, so the disguise only served to make him look a bit silly. His servant Xanthias accompanied him, carrying their luggage and enduring Dionysus's constant nerves and complaints. On their way to the underworld, Dionysus repeatedly asked Xanthias what dangers lay ahead, growing more anxious with every answer. Maybe you're travelling right now. Is there anything you're worrying about that's coming up on the journey? Any known unknowns that are causing just a little bit of a stomach flutter? Are you using Citymapper or Google to find your way today? What would happen if you lost your connection and it stopped working? Well, imagine that feeling turned up to the max. No Citymapper where these two were going. Whenever anything slightly frightening appeared, Dionysus was quick to panic, while Xanthias remained calm and often found himself stifling a laugh. Eventually, they reached the house of Heracles himself to ask for directions to the underworld. Heracles burst out laughing when he saw Dionysus dressed in his clothes and heard his plan. Trying to ignore him, Dionysus asked him for the quickest way to Hades. You could hang yourself, said Heracles. Drink some poison, or, I know, you could jump off a tower. Eventually, though, he did help. He gave Dionysus detailed instructions, including telling him that he needed to cross the great river Acheron, which separated the world of the living from the dead. A body of water as trouble-strewn, treacherous and impactful on the world as the Strait of Hormuz. He also warned Dionysus about the strange and frightening things he might encounter along the way. Monsters, spirits, and terrible punishments called things like the great mire of filth and the eternal stream of dung. Armed with this knowledge, Dionysus and Xanthias continued until they reached the river. There they met Charon, the ferryman. Charon agreed to take Dionysus across, but only if he rowed the boat himself. Xanthias, being a slave, would have to make the journey on foot around the lake. As Dionysus got going, he soon realised how difficult rowing was. His arms ached and the dark water stretched endlessly before him. Then, from the shadows, came the sound of croaking. A chorus of frogs surrounded the boat, chanting loudly and rhythmically, their croaks echoing across the water. Dionysus found himself getting irritated and tried to shout back at them, but the frogs only croaked louder. It was now becoming a croak-off. By the time he reached the other side, he was exhausted and thoroughly annoyed. He'd already had plenty of doubts along the way about the wisdom of making this journey, and the mocking of the frogs suddenly made him feel like his quest was silly and meaningless. But then, he thought, they also reminded him of the jabbering, chaotic voices of the Athenian citizens, so different to the refined poetry of a master like Euripides. Mock they might, but they needed to be saved. his determination to succeed, to bring Euripides back to renew a flailing city, found new strength. Meanwhile, Xanthias faced his own challenges on land, encountering strange creatures and eerie sights. Now, is there something you do in your life that you never get enough credit for? Something you do around the house? Or for someone you know? Something you once did that you never got a thank you for? Go on, you can admit it. I'm not going to make you tell anyone. Maybe you've always kept it to yourself. And maybe you're okay with that. But maybe you sometimes feel the indignation and resentment building up inside, and it's something you can't release. Not without burning some bridges anyway. Well, Xanthias had been building up a whole cartload of resentment long before this journey, and it was multiplying by the second now. But as a slave, there was categorically no chance of any release or offloading for him. Simply not in the job description. But what he'd have liked to have said when he was reunited with his master was, "Not only have I had to walk the long way round carrying all our bags, there is no doubt that I am dealing with everything far more sensibly than you. I am showing a level of bravery that you, Dionyssus, could only pretend to have. You are a bully and a coward, and I quit." But he didn't say that. He just said, "Hello." But he wasn't wrong. When Dionyssus suddenly saw a horrible creature that looked like a mule at first, but then morphed into a woman and then a dog, he was terrified, guessing the creature was Empusa, and ran off to hide. Only when Xanthias scared the creature away did Dionyssus return, blaming Xanthias and jabbering about how it had made him turn white. Xanthias noticed that Dionyssus had also shit himself. They continued deeper into the underworld, where Dionyssus's disguise as Heracles began to cause serious problems. True, some figures greeted him warmly, remembering Heracles as a hero, but when Dionyssus and Xanthias arrived at Hades' palace, Dionyssus knocked on the door and was greeted by Aeacus, the formidable doorkeeper. When Dionyssus introduced himself as Heracles, Aeacus cursed him and called him a criminal for stealing Cerberus. He threatened to torture him in retaliation and disappeared inside to fetch his favourite torture devices. Dionyssus shat himself again. He ordered Xanthias to swap clothes with him, which Xanthias did, holding his nose and carefully avoiding putting on the most excrement-stained items. So many incredible deities out there, and he had to be the servant of a loose-boweled wine boar. Once the clothes swap was complete, a maid emerged from the palace and happily greeted Xanthias, thinking he was Heracles. She announced that Persephone, Hades' wife, had been preparing an elaborate meal the minute she heard Heracles was coming, and that there were girls waiting inside to dance for him. Xanthias told the maid he'd be right there. After the maid had gone, Xanthias, addressing Dionyssus as boy, ordered him to bring the luggage inside. Dionyssus then said he was only joking when he suggested that he and Xanthias switch places. Reluctantly, Xanthias gave him back the Heracles disguise. But Dionyssus had barely got back into his Heracles outfit when two landladies appeared and identified him as the rascal who'd eaten all their food and then left without paying for any of it. Xanthias had great fun encouraging the women as they berated Dionyssus, as Heracles, for his gluttony. The second landlady announced her plans to find Cleon to punish him. Then she and the first landlady went back inside. Dionyssus tried to cajole Xanthias into trading places again. Xanthias resisted for a bit, but gave in after Dionyssus promised he wouldn't change his mind again. The two swapped clothing once more. Aeacus returned, followed by slaves carrying ropes and chains. He ordered them to tie down Xanthias, now dressed again as Heracles, and punish him. Dionyssus excitedly urged them to give Heracles exactly what he deserved. But Xanthias, as Heracles, made a deal with Aeacus. He would accept his punishment if he was found guilty, and in the meantime, Aeacus could torture his slave, i.e. Dionyssus, now dressed as Xanthias. Aeacus agreed to this, and Xanthias, as Heracles, enthusiastically told Aeacus to take his slave away and not hold back. You following all the back and forth changes of outfits? Well done, you're doing better than me. Panicked, Dionysus told Aeacus that he was the god Dionysus. Xanthias suggested that Aeacus give Dionysus a flogging to test if he was telling the truth. If he really was a god, he wouldn't cry out in pain. Aeacus agreed, and delivered alternate whacks between Xanthias and Dionysus with stronger blows each round. At first, Xanthias and Dionysus pretended not to feel anything. During the second round, Xanthias cried out in pain, but pretended it was simply a pious impulse. Dionysus also reacted to his second blow and tried to make an excuse, claiming he was just reacting to seeing men on horseback. Aeacus gave them each a third blow, and each reacted more strongly. Aeacus, frustrated, decided to take Xanthias and Dionysus to Hades and Persephone, who would be able to tell which of them was a god. Finally, they were going in. And inside the palace, bingo! There he was, Euripides. No more searching required. Offer him the chance to come back to life and Bob's your uncle, job done. But it looked like it wasn't going to be as straightforward as that. Euripides was in the middle of a heated dispute with none other than Aeschylus. Two of the greatest playwrights of all time were arguing over who deserved to be crowned king of tragedy. Euripides claimed that his work was clever, modern, and intellectually sharp. He believed that he'd improved tragedy by making characters more realistic and by questioning traditional ideas. Aeschylus, however, argued that his plays were grand, powerful, and morally uplifting. He believed theatre should inspire greatness and teach audiences to be better citizens. The argument became so intense that Hades declared a contest must decide the winner. Dionysus, as the god of theatre, was chosen as the judge. At first, he was thrilled. This was exactly what he had come for. But as the contest began, he realised how difficult the decision would be. The two playwrights competed in a series of challenges. Think rap battle for ancient Greek poets. They criticised each other's prologues, mocked each other's characters, and even recited lines to prove whose poetry was more meaningful. This being the underworld, the contest wasn't always grounded in what we might call logical reality. At one point, they placed their lines of verse on a set of scales, weighing them to see which had more substance. Aeschylus's heavier lines were declared more powerful. Which to choose? I mean, I wouldn't know where to start, would you? And the problem was that he respected them both. Imagine two friends out of nowhere suddenly asking you to say who's the better cook, or your flatmates asking you to tell them who leaves the bathroom in a better state, or two actor friends asking you to declare who's the better actor. Helpfully for Dionysus, their tactics were distinct. Euripides used clever arguments and logic, picking apart Aeschylus's work with precision. Aeschylus responded with bold, commanding language, insisting that poetry should elevate the soul and strengthen the state. As Dionysus listened, he found himself changing his mind. He had originally come to rescue Euripides, but now he began to question that choice. Athens was in trouble. It needed guidance, strength, and wisdom, not just cleverness. Finally, Dionysus made his decision. Not Euripides, but Aeschylus would return with him to the world of the living. The decision surprised many, but Dionysus explained that Aeschylus's work would better serve Athens in its time of need. In fact, even before leaving, Aeschylus offered advice for the city, urging its leaders to act wisely, restore justice, and remember the values that had once made Athens strong. With that, Dionysus prepared to return home, bringing Aeschylus with him. The journey had been filled with fear, confusion, strangeness, and a little bit of excrement, but it also led to an important realization. He had been right to think that theatre was not just entertainment. It had the power to shape society, to guide people, and to help a city find its way in difficult times. The Athenian citizens, whom he couldn't help but see now as a jarring chorus of frogs, would jabber incoherently no more. So, the ending of this story might make you go, oh. It seems like Aristophanes is attempting to guide the audience to believe that in a contest between old virtue versus modern doubt, the regression back to old virtue is not only the correct course, but necessary. Comparisons with today's world are, of course, fraught with difficulty. But while it's true that Aristophanes was a proponent of moderate democracy and peace, not necessarily a populist partisan, and though it's important to remember that he was writing when Athens was on the brink of losing the Peloponnesian War, which was creating a desperate existential desire in Athenians for a return to stability, even so, the fundamental idea on which the story seems to land, to make Athens great again seems to have parallels with our contemporary MAGA movement in the USA. But was this what the writer of this story, Aristophanes, wanted too? Or just his characters, Dionysus and Aeschylus? Was he simply raising the question? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that's all for this summer silly season special double bill. Ooh, it's getting rather hot here, so I think it's time I jumped in the lake. Have a wonderful summer, everybody. Stay curious, stay silly, and keep telling stories. Yahoo!